Two, there are two reasons I fell in love with neon. Number one, as soon as you go down here, hold on your finger, you get these kind of slidey lists, and these are gorgeous. It's not something we often see on iOS, so I'm welcoming it. Now, the second thing that makes Neon Midi Sequencer so special is its sheer amount of modifiers. The way that you can modify your playback is crazy. You see, if you want to do straightforward stuff with it, you can absolutely do that. However, if you're one of those people who want to go straight to Oz, you absolutely can. Right. Oh, and by the way, I want to thank you so much for all the love you gave me on my last video. Yeah, my name is Jakob haQ. I'm your host, and you're watching a haQ attaQ episode. To start out, I want to show you these two views. One of them is the standalone, where you're running Neon as its own thing, and in this case, it has an internal clock. Now, you can find clock settings and everything up here, but you won't be seeing this item when you're loading Neon as an AUV3, since in that case, Neon will sync to the AUV3 host. Other than the clock settings and MIDI settings inside the standalone version, both versions are identical in how they operate. So for simplicity, I will be working with the AUV3 version of Neon. If we look at the interface of Neon, we can see four distinct sections. At the top, we have menu tabs, and then we have sliders where we can set the pitch for each of the 8 stages. That's what they're called inside Neon. Now, you can view these stages as steps in the sequencer, and even though there are only 8 of them, what you can do with each stage individually can easily prolong a stage. So, in the end, the entire sequence becomes way longer than just 8 steps. Now, there is also a way of disabling stages in here, and that is by double tapping on a stage. And by doing that, you're graying it out and it won't be read by the sequencer. Right, next we have a pulse count setting, and under the pulse count setting, we've got gate modes. Something that is very important to understand in Neon is the relation between pulse count and gate modes. So a pulse inside Neon is basically the same as a 16th note, and when you're running the sequencer, it's being driven by 16 pulses. Now, even though that's the case, you can still change the pulse count for each stage between 1 to 8 pulses. And if you do end up changing the pulse count for a stage, what will happen is it will go through each of the stages in sequence, and then when it hits that stage with more pulse counts, it will just count through them before it moves on to the next stage. And the way that notes are being played back all depends on what type of gate mode you've selected. So if we then go down to the gate modes and we look at them, we can see that right now it says single in all of the stages. And this is what it will look like in their default state. Now, single basically means that a note will be generated on the first pulse of a stage. So even if you set it to 8 pulses, you will only have one note being generated on that first pulse. However, that's not the case for if you change the gate mode to multi. You see, in multi, there will be a note generated for each of the pulses that you've selected in the pulse count. Now, the hold mode will basically just hold the note being generated on the first pulse of a stage for the duration of that stage. And if it hits another stage that has some other mode in it, it will keep playing as normal. However, if the stage directly after also has a hold mode, then this will work like a tie mode. Now, the last gate mode, rest, will not generate any notes at all. It's like leaving an empty space in your sequence. Now, before we move on to modifiers, I want to bring your attention to the settings tab. If we press this, we get this little window. If we zoom in, we can see that we can change the root note of the scale itself. We can also change the octave, and we can change the order of how stages are being played back. Now, you can also run the sequencer in reverse, and we can also divide the clock. So even if our main sequencer or the AUV through host is running at 120 BPMs, we can get Neon to run at 60 BPMs by just dividing the clock in half. Now, continuing in the upper bar jumping over modifiers, we'll take that last, and heading to presets, here we can save and load our own presets. And not only that, we can also export our own presets so that we can share them with others. Now, this is really straightforward. You just simply tap down and drag the preset name to the right to open up the sharing menu. However, if you drag it to the left, you'll open up the paper basket, and this way you can delete the preset. Now, if we close down the preset browser and open up states, we can see a new row of letters at the bottom. There's 8 letters, and these states allow you to do different changes for all of these sliders, all of the pulses and gate modes, and then you can switch between them. So you can basically see them as pattern selectors. Now, there is a way of copying and pasting states, and we can do that by simply holding down on a state and dragging it on top of another and drop it down. Now, when we did that, when we started dragging it, we saw something else happening up here, but we're going to go into that a little bit later on. Now, you can switch between states when you're playing back the sequencer. However, there's always this pulse countdown happening in the background. So even if you are switching between states quickly, it won't just switch over to the new state you just tapped on. No, it will actually queue it up sometimes, and you can actually see the text queued when you do this. This way, your switching will always be synced. Now, there is a mini song mode in here. It's called Meta Sequencer. To build a meta sequence, you hold your finger down on a state until you get this slot system up here. And then you drag the state up here and drop it down. Now, if you keep doing this with a bunch of states, you are getting your little meta sequence, and then you have a setting for how many pulses you want each of the states to play for. A normal run of the sequence is 16 pulses, so that's why you get 16 pulses from the get-go, but you can easily make this 32 to have each state play 2 times or whatever you want. Now, once you have built your own chain of states that you want to play in a meta sequence, well, you have to make sure that it's on, because in the initial state, it's always off. So we open up the settings tab, and we can now see this item here where it says meta sequencer off. Now, if we hold down our finger and scroll down to on, we can now play the sequence that we've put together here. Oh, and let me just add that you won't see this option if you don't have a meta sequence set up already. So now we get to the fun thing inside Neon, the modifiers, and there are two things I want to highlight with them. So number one, a modifier is like its own sequencer track. It also has 8 stages, it can have its own playback order, and it can also have its own rate. And something I really love here is that there is an option of getting, well, basically the modifier playback order to be affected by what's going on inside the stages or how notes are being played, which can lead to some crazy results. Now, the second thing I want to highlight is the modifier sequencer menu, where we actually get to assign what a modifier is supposed to do. And the easiest way of getting to the menu is just simply tapping on this icon here, and now we have that menu overlaying the actual sequencer. Now, I don't like working like this because I don't like overlapping menus. So if you are like me, well, then all you have to do is just tap the Settings tab, and now that same menu will pop up on the left side instead. It'll be smaller, but it won't be overlaying the actual sequencer. Now, before we move on, I'm just gonna go in here and change the modifier type so that we have something selected. I'm just gonna select the first thing in the list, which is octave. If we actually look at the modifier track here, we can see two things. We can see a row of zeros, and if we tap down and hold on one of the zeros, we can see that this list reaches up to 5, and if we go down to -5. Why? Well, because right now we've selected octave as a modifier type, and what's in these lists will change depending on the type of modifier you've selected. Now we also have something called trigger conditions down here, and if we press down and hold, we have a bunch of options like probability settings. Now, right now it says on, which means that this step will always affect the sequence. Now we can also turn this off, which means that whatever is going on in this modifier on this particular step will not affect the sequence at all. And then if we keep scrolling up, we get probability settings based on percentages. And so if we set it to 30%, then there is a 30% chance that this step will actually affect the sequence. However, if we go higher up in the list, we get probabilities based on intervals. And so if we select 1, 3 here, then basically this step will affect the sequence once every third. Lastly, under the row of zeros, we see add modifier, and when we press that, we get another unassigned modifier track. And if you're wondering how many you can have, well, you can have up to 8 modifier tracks per state. Alright, so let's have a look at modifier types. Now, there's 2 in here handling pitch, the octave shift and also transpose. And whenever I'm working with pitch, I'm also adding another modifier layer where I'm controlling velocity. Now, CC stands for Midi CC, and when you've got this selected, you can select the parameter number over here in this list, and then you can set up the value you want it to output on that parameter number. Next up are 2 modifiers that are related to pulses. And in the case of pulse pattern, it actually gives us a way of basically setting at what pulse a note is being generated on. One thing to highlight here is that you want to, of course, use more than one pulse for the stages when you're using it, and the pulse pattern modifier will only work on stages where you've got the multi-gate mode on. Now, the second pulse thing is pulse count, and this will allow the user to set up additions or subtractions of pulses for stages. So if you have a stage set up with 6 pulses and you set up one of these modifiers with pulse count to subtract 2, it will simply end up subtracting 2 and count only 4. And yeah, I think you get the gist of it. Next up, we have two gate modes, but they're very different from one another because gate mode will override the gate mode set for the current stage. You know, single, multi, rest, things like that. Gate length, however, has to do with how long notes are being played for. And I haven't told you yet, but in the initial state, the gate mode for all stages are 50%, which means a note will be played for 50% of the stage time. And what decides how long a stage is? Well, the pulse count. So, if you have a pulse count at 8, then the note will be generated for 4 pulses because the gate length is 50% in its initial state. Now, this can of course be overridden, and you do that with the gate length modifier. And here you can now set up gate lengths anywhere from 1% up to 99%. Now, for the next item on our list, which is ratchet, well, this one allows the user, of course, to add ratcheting notes to the sequence. However, the ratcheting will behave differently depending on the gate mode you've selected for a stage. You see, if you've got multi-selected, the ratchets will be spread out over the length of each individual pulse. But if you're using single as a gate mode, the ratchets will be spread out over the entire length of a stage. Now, the last item in our modifier list is division, and this one allows the user to get really weird and funky with the rhythms, because with this one you can add and or subtract to the clock divisions. Now, we're almost entirely done with all of the features of the Neon sequencer. However, there are some really powerful tools still in here, and they can be found in the settings for modifiers. So all of the modifier sequences will have this settings box here, and in it you've got order, advanced mode, division, enabled, and stage mask. Now enabled simply just lets the user to turn an entire modifier sequence on or off, and division allows you to basically divide the rate at which the modifier sequence is running in the relation to the sequencer clock. Yeah, so those two are pretty straightforward. However, there are some really useful tools in here. And one of them is the stage mask. Now, this one will allow the user to specify which of the stages should be affected by a modifier sequence. And in the initial state, all of the stages are selected. They're highlighted in here, but if you tap a number, it goes dark. And now you've basically excluded an entire stage from the modifier sequence. This is super powerful. Now, the second really powerful tool in here is the Advanced mode. You see, in the beginning of this video, I told you that the main sequencer is being driven by 16 16th note pulses. However, this behavior can be overridden, and instead you can have the modifier sequences advanced based upon notes being played in the stages. Now, the first option, called Note, will do exactly that. It will just look at the stages, listen to when notes are being played, and advance the sequence for the modifier based upon that. However, if you do have ratcheting notes in your sequence playing in the stages, and you want to include those for driving the advancement, then you just simply choose the other option called Ratchet. Now, the last thing to highlight here is the playback order, and both the main sequence have this and also the modifier sequences. However, for the modifier sequences, there is an option that you can't find in the main one, and it is sync. And when you've selected this, it will basically sync to the order of the main sequence, and will also at the same time bypass whatever you've done with the advanced mode and also division for the modifier sequencer. If we look at what order does, it basically says how sequences are being read back, both for the main stages up here and also the motion sequencer. Now, if we have a look in the list and we scroll down to, for instance, Diverge, then it starts reading the sequence from the middle and then jumps further and further out towards the edges, and it does that over and over again. Pendulum and Ping Pong just reads the sequence back and forth. However, one of them just reads an extra step at the end and at the beginning before it turns around. If we want some random options, then we of course have Random, but then we also have Shuffle and Brownian. Now, there are some more items in this list, but I think you get the point. Depending on what you're using in here, you can completely change how an entire sequence behaves. And this is fun just to play around with after you put in a lot of time just programming a sequence. So it turns out that Aaron, the guy who actually makes Neon Midi Sequencer, had a great idea. He thought of adding a modifier into the app that would allow the user to change the playback order for the main sequence. And that is such an awesome feature to have. I love it. And he actually put it into the app with the latest update. I tested it out and it wasn't working for me. So he's now gonna take it out of the app to fix it. And here I want to take this opportunity to talk about debugging and how almost impossible it can be for a developer to actually fix a bug if they don't have a way of reproducing the bug. And so I'll show you the bug. I'm gonna open up AUM here, add a MIDI track, load Neon Midi Sequencer, and then we're gonna go down to the modifiers and we're gonna add the new order modifier, which is going to be removed from the app until Aaron can fix it. But yeah, we're gonna choose this, and then we're gonna press in here and we're gonna slide in this list and it's gonna freeze. And this happens consistently, not only on one of my devices, an iPad M2, but it also happens on my older iPad Pro 12.9 inch from 2015. Yeah, consistently on both of them. So how come Aaron could not reproduce this bug on his device, even though I could do it on two devices? Well, it turns out it was the iOS version. We actually ended up talking over FaceTime for an hour. I had to show him this bug consistently happening on both of my devices. And the only difference between his device and my two devices was the iOS version. You see, he had recently upgraded to iOS 17, and me, I'm still running iOS 16, 16.3 on the old one, 16.7 on the new one. So he had to go out, find a friend with an iDevice that was still running iOS 16 in order to test this. And yesterday night, I got an email from him saying that he had gotten such a device, he had tested it out, and he was now able to reproduce it. And so yeah, it's definitely an iOS 16 specific bug. Yeah, this stuff is not easy. So whenever you're reporting bugs to a developer, try to be specific, explain what's going on. Don't just send one of those, "Oh, this is not working, 1-star review," because that's not gonna fix anything.
Bruh. Stop, bruh. Stop.
So for my final thoughts, I want to say that Neon Midi Sequencer is one of the craziest MIDI sequencers I've used so far. It is absolutely insane. The sheer amount of modifiers, the way that you can run the modifiers and handle the stages, how you can almost do a little bit of math with the pulses and things, the orders, everything you can modify. It's just, the combos are insane and part of the fun you can have with Neon Midi Sequencer. And that's the thing, I'm just having fun when I'm working with it, because thanks to the slider lists, it's also very quick to work with. However, there is one case where the slider list is kind of horrible to work with, and it is the case of the scales list, because it goes on forever. Aaron decided to put every scale in the world in there. Well, at least it feels like it. And you basically have to put down your finger, scroll it all the way down to the bottom of the screen, and you still haven't reached the end of the list. So if you're into that stuff, if you want to try out a bunch of scales, Neon has got you covered. And it's the only one I don't like working with, but for everything else, the slider list are perfect. And the minimalistic interface also makes Neon Midi Sequencer perfect for just live performance, because there's so little on the screen that you have to deal with. I love this so much. If you're into MIDI sequencing, then you definitely want to go and get this one. You'll find a link to the app down in the pinned comment, and if you have any features that you would like to see Aaron introduce in future updates, then why don't you suggest them in the comment section? Maybe you already have Neon Midi Sequencer, you're convinced that it's amazing, why don't you tell everyone about that? However, maybe you're not into this sort of stuff. Maybe you don't like it at all. Maybe you really do hate the slider list. Just comment down below. Tell everyone reading the comment section down there what you feel about the app. And yeah, that's pretty much it. As usual, I wish you a very productive week. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it.